On September 28, 1999, Osle County, Kentucky, bore witness to the discovery of one of the most troubling cases of family inbreeding and isolation ever recorded in the United States. Located in the heart of the Appalachians, Osle was already known as one of America's poorest counties, where for generations, families had lived in isolated valleys, cut off from the rest of the world by mountains and roads that became impassable during harsh winters. That day, as a light drizzle veiled the mountains in mist, a state social services team was conducting routine visits to unregistered properties when they came upon a dilapidated house in a part of the region known as La Rose. The property lay almost 5 miles off the main road, accessible only by a dirt path that meandered through pine trees and ancient oaks. What they found there would permanently alter the quiet history of that valley. The house, a wooden structure darkened by age, had no windows, only openings covered with plastic and cardboard. The roof had obvious holes, and the surrounding land was overgrown with tall weeds and rust. The first thing that caught the social worker's attention was the extraordinary silence. Even on the most remote properties, there were always sounds, chickens, an old radio, conversations. Here, the silence seemed to be an entity of its own. When they knocked on the door, an elderly-looking woman greeted them, later identified as 72-year-old Martha Branham. She tried to prevent the team from entering, but the strong odor from inside and the woman's visibly frail appearance justified immediate intervention. Inside the house, which had no electricity or running water, lived 6 people: Martha, her 49-year-old daughter Eloise Branham, and 4 younger women, who were later identified as Eloise's daughters. The 4 women, who appeared to be between 18 and 30 years old, showed disturbing physical traits. They had asymmetrical faces, severe strabismus, prominent jaws, and most notably, an obvious difficulty with communication. None of them spoke clearly, only making guttural sounds and basic phrases that they alone seemed to understand. The scene shocked even the most experienced social workers. In their official reports, they wrote that the women moved through the space like ghosts, seemingly not fully aware of their presence. Their movements were uncoordinated, and they all showed repetitive mannerisms, such as constantly rocking back and forth. Most unsettling was the complete lack of official records. None of the 4 women had a birth certificate, school record, or any official document. It was as if they did not exist to the world outside those walls. This case would mark just the beginning of a discovery of inbreeding that had gone on for decades, an invisible cycle of isolation, abuse, and neglect that created one of the clearest examples of the devastating effects of continuous family crossbreeding. While authorities tried to make sense of what they were seeing, the 4 sisters, Agnes, Mary, Louise, and Catherine, the names they would later receive as they had no official identities, remained seated on the dirt floor, as if this interruption was just a brief inconvenience in decades of silence. However, the true story of these women had started long before, in another era of Kentucky, when geographical and cultural isolation created the ideal conditions for a family to become insular for generations. If you want to hear more cases like this, which shake entire societies and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss an investigation. Following the initial discovery, county authorities faced an unprecedented challenge: how to investigate a situation with virtually no records, external witnesses, or formal documentation. The 4 women were immediately taken to Cumberland Valley Regional Hospital for a medical evaluation, while Eloise and Martha remained in custody. The first medical reports, dated September 30, 1981, revealed a worrying situation. The 4 sisters had a series of physical and cognitive characteristics consistent with what doctors at the time called degeneration due to inbreeding. Dr. Robert Harkins, the head of the medical team, noted in his confidential report, "We are dealing with a case where family endogamy appears to have occurred over multiple generations, leading to classic signs of accumulated recessive disorders." The investigation into the family history met with significant obstacles from the start. Martha Branham refused to cooperate, claiming that family matters were nobody's business. The little information she provided was vague and contradictory. Eloise, in turn, had limited cognitive ability and showed clear signs of deep psychological trauma. It was through parish records from the local Baptist church and testimonies from distant neighbors that investigators began to piece together the Branham lineage's macabre puzzle. The first clues pointed to a history that went back to the 1920s when William Branham, Eloise's father, settled in that remote region after leaving a mining community in Harlan County. One of the most important accounts came from Joseph Miller, then 83 years old, who had lived about 2 miles from the Branham property since 1925. According to his statement to social worker Margaret Thompson on October 5, 1981, William was an odd man who didn't let anyone near his property. He married a second cousin, Sally, who already had trouble speaking properly. After she died during childbirth around 1940, we never saw an adult woman in that house again, just little Eloise growing up. The other children, 2 boys, also never left. Another crucial point in the investigation was the testimony of Florence Watson, a midwife who had worked in the region since the 1930s. In her statement on October 12, 1981, she revealed, "I was called to the Branham property in 1945 to help a young woman give birth. When I got there, I saw it was Eloise, only 13 years old, pregnant and in labor. William didn't let me stay after the baby was born, a boy. I tried to alert the sheriff at the time, but no one wanted to get involved with the Branhams." The investigation began to focus on rebuilding the timeline of births on the property. Between 1945 and 1963, Eloise apparently gave birth to 6 children, including the 4 women found in 1981. There were no formal records for any of these births, and the lack of genetic testing at the time made it impossible to determine paternity with certainty. However, the clinical evaluation and collected testimonies pointed to a disturbing scenario. William Branham had not only abused his own daughter, Eloise, but his sons, Eloise's brothers, apparently continued the incestuous cycle after his death in 1967, which resulted in the birth of the 4 women. A false lead emerged when investigators speculated that the women might belong to an isolationist religious community. This theory was quickly dismissed after consultations with experts on religious groups in the region. Another line of investigation considered a possible connection to family clans that produced moonshine, illegally distilled liquor common in the region during and after the Prohibition era, but this also turned up no concrete evidence. One of the most significant obstacles to the investigation was the sudden death of Martha Branham on October 29, 1981, just 1 month after the case was discovered. The elderly woman died at the county hospital from complications of pneumonia and malnutrition, taking with her many of the answers that investigators were seeking. By November 1981, the official investigation had established a primary theory. William Branham had started a cycle of incestuous abuse with his daughter Eloise in the 1940s, leading to the birth of children who, in turn, continued the consanguineous cycle with their own mother and among themselves. The 4 women found in 1981 were the result of this complex genetic mix, being simultaneously daughters, sisters, and cousins in a family tree that folded in on itself. The Ozark County Prosecutor's Office faced an unprecedented dilemma. How to proceed legally in a case where the main witnesses and potential defendants had severe cognitive limitations or were already deceased. Moreover, the statute of limitations for many of the crimes had expired, given that the initial abuses dated back to the 1940s. In an internal memo from December 14, 1981, District Attorney Clarence Hammond wrote, "This case represents not only an unprecedented legal challenge but also a systemic failure of our social and community institutions. While we try to hold the potential perpetrators who are still alive accountable, we must admit that society as a whole has failed these women for decades." As the investigation progressed into 1982, major discoveries began to surface from the Branham family's silent past. In January of that year, researchers from the University of Kentucky were called to evaluate the case from a broader medical and anthropological perspective. The team, led by Dr. Helen Montgomery, a specialist in population genetics, analyzed medical records and conducted extensive interviews with longtime residents of the area. One of the most telling documents was found in the local church's archives, a baptismal record book with notes from Pastor Jonathan Williams dated 1935, where he expressed concern about the improper marriage between William Branham and his cousin Sally. The pastor wrote, "I visited the Branham family today and found a concerning situation. William and Sally share maternal grandparents, and signs that our ancestors would associate with too much mixed blood are already visible in the children. In March 1982, the investigation located a diary belonging to midwife Florence Watson, who had died in 1979. In its yellowed pages, they found detailed accounts of the births she had attended at the Branham property between 1945 and 1963. In a particularly disturbing entry from August 1951, she wrote, "I was called to the Branham house again. Little Eloise, now 19 years old, gave birth to her third child. The child has the same distant eyes as the others. No man besides William and his sons lives on that property. May God have mercy on those children." Florence's diary showed that she had documented 6 births from Eloise in 1945, 1947, 1951, 1954, 1958, and 1963. The 4 women found in 1981 corresponded to the births of 1951, Agnes, 1954, Mary, 1958, Louise, and 1963, Catherine. There was no mention of the first 2 children in more recent records. A particularly impactful discovery came when the medical team performed cranial radiographs and detailed physical exams on the 4 sisters. Dr. Samuel Pierce, a specialist in genetic disorders from the University Hospital, noted, "The patterns of bone, facial, and neurological anomalies present in the 4 women are consistent with the buildup of harmful recessive genes through multiple generations of inbreeding. The asymmetrical craniofacial malformations present in all of them are especially notable, suggesting a very close common ancestor." In April 1982, an accidental discovery shed new light on the case. During repair work on a secondary road near the Branham property, workers found bone remains buried in a swampy area. Forensic analysis, completed in June 1982, identified the remains as belonging to 2 children, about 2 and 5 years old, who had been buried at least 30 years prior. Although it was impossible to be certain of the children's identity without genetic testing, which would only become available years later, the location and timing matched Eloise's first 2 children, who were never found. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation came through a late testimony from Harriet Comomes, a social worker who had briefly visited the property in 1967 after receiving an anonymous complaint. In her statement in July 1982, she reported, "I arrived at the property and was met by Martha, who kept me from entering. I could briefly see inside through the half-open door. I saw several people sitting on the floor, including young women and at least 2 adult men. What struck me was that they all rocked back and forth in the same rhythm, as if in a trance. Martha said they were just praying in their own way and that I should respect their religious beliefs." Comomes admitted she didn't insist on the inspection and didn't formally record the incident because of pressure from the local community not to interfere in mountain matters. Her late testimony showed how cultural isolation and institutional neglect had allowed the cycle of abuse to continue for decades. In August 1982, investigators located a former postal worker who made deliveries in the region between 1960 and 1975. He reported that William Branham regularly received correspondence from a state institution in Frankfurt, likely related to social or agricultural benefits. This indicated that despite their isolation, the family had some minimal contact with government institutions, which, however, never conducted follow-up visits. A crucial piece of evidence emerged in September 1982 when Dr. Montgomery's team analyzed old community photographs and identified Eloise in a school photo from 1940, her only appearance in official records. The 8-year-old girl already showed subtle physical signs compatible with first-degree consanguinity, suggesting that the incestuous cycle could have begun even before her, possibly with her own parents. Throughout these months of investigation, the 4 sisters remained in a state institution for people with cognitive disabilities, where they received proper medical care and basic education for the first time. The institution's reports indicated modest but meaningful progress. After 6 months, Agnes and Mary could already communicate with simple phrases and learn basic self-care tasks. Louise and Catherine, the youngest, showed greater adaptability and learning capacity. Leave a comment. Never give up on the truth if you believe all missing persons deserve to be found. By the end of 1982, after more than a year of intensive investigation, Kentucky authorities had finally documented what became known as the Branham case, one of the most extreme examples of family isolation and continuous inbreeding in the United States. The story that came to light was more complex and disturbing than the initial assumptions. William Branham, born in 1902, grew up in a remote mining community in the Appalachians, where marriages between cousins were fairly common due to geographical and cultural isolation. In 1920, he married his second cousin, Sally Jenkins, with whom he had 3 children, Eloise, born in 1932, and 2 boys, Jacob, 1934, and Caleb, 1936. After Sally's death during the birth of a 4th stillborn child in 1938, William isolated the family even more, moving to a remote property in Ozark County. It was there, as investigators determined, that he started a cycle of incestuous abuse with his daughter Eloise, resulting in the birth of her first child in 1945 when she was only 13 years old. From there, the horror multiplied. Both William and his sons, Jacob and Caleb, had incestuous relationships with Eloise, creating a complex genetic web where the subsequent children were simultaneously siblings, half-siblings, and cousins. Martha, William's mother-in-law and Sally's mother, remained on the property throughout this time, seemingly accepting or unable to stop what was happening. The final legal documents compiled in December 1982 established the following timeline and genealogy. 1945, birth of Eloise's first child, paternity attributed to William, her own father. This child, a boy, died at age 2 and was buried on the property. 1947, birth of the second child, uncertain paternity between William and Jacob, Eloise's father or brother. This child also died in early childhood. 1951, birth of Agnes, paternity attributed to Caleb, Eloise's brother. 1954, birth of Mary, paternity attributed to Jacob, Eloise's brother. 1958, birth of Louise, paternity possibly attributed to the son born in 1945, Eloise's son and brother, before his death. 1963, birth of Catherine, paternity attributed to William, shortly before his death. The genetic implications were profound. Dr. Samuel Pierce explained in his final report, this case represents an extreme example of multigenerational consanguinity where the coefficient of inbreeding reached levels rarely documented in modern medical literature. The physical manifestations seen in the 4 surviving women are consistent with the homozygotic expression of multiple harmful recessive genes. In medical terms, the 4 sisters had a combination of rare genetic conditions, including moderate microcephaly, characteristic craniofacial deformities, moderate to severe intellectual disability, skeletal anomalies, especially in their extremities, congenital heart problems in 3 of them, partial hearing loss, and neurological disorders that appeared as repetitive movements and communication difficulties. The legal resolution of the case was complicated by several factors. William Branham had died in 1967. Jacob and Caleb, who would have been between 46 and 48 years old in 1982, were never located. Investigators suspected they had also died or left the area years earlier. Eloise, at 50 years old in 1982, was evaluated as being severely cognitively impaired and legally unable to be held responsible for her actions. On February 14, 1983, Judge Howard Thornton issued his final ruling. Eloise Branham was declared legally incapacitated and sent to a state institution for long-term care. No formal criminal charges were filed due to the deaths of the main perpetrators and Eloise's mental state. The 4 sisters, Agnes, Mary, Louise, and Catherine, became wards of the state of Kentucky and remained in specialized institutions. The case's impact on the local community and state institutions was profound. In March 1983, the Kentucky Department of Social Services introduced a new protocol for regular visits to isolated properties, particularly in mountainous regions with a history of cultural isolation. State legislation was revised to strengthen child protection and abuse prevention measures. For the small community of Ozark County, the case was a turning point. The silence that had allowed horror to continue for decades was finally broken. In an editorial in the local Ozark County News in April 1983, the editor wrote, "For too long, we have hidden our eyes behind the idea of family privacy and mountain autonomy. The Branham case teaches us a painful lesson about the cost of silence and collective indifference." The later developments of the case revealed more about the lasting effects of extreme inbreeding. Throughout the 1980s, the four sisters received medical treatments and special education they had never had access to before. The institution's reports documented slow but meaningful progress. Agnes, the oldest, never developed full speech, but she learned basic sign communication and could perform simple tasks with supervision. She died in 1997 from cardiac complications at the age of 46. Mary showed greater adaptability, learning to read simple words and developing a remarkable artistic ability. Her drawings, which often showed four female figures holding hands, were kept by the institution. She died in 2001 at age 47 from a respiratory infection. Louise, considered the most resilient of the four, eventually managed to work at supervised tasks in the institution's laundry and formed basic social relationships with staff and other residents. She died in 2008 at the age of 50. Catherine, the youngest, showed the most significant cognitive gains after receiving proper stimulation. In 1990, she was moved to a supervised residential group home where she lived until her death in 2012 at the age of 49. The old Branham property, the site of decades of horror, was eventually taken by the state for unpaid taxes. In 1990, the deteriorated structure was demolished, and the area gradually returned to nature. Today, few local residents can identify the exact spot where the house once stood. In 2002, a small memorial was established in the county cemetery dedicated to the Branham sisters and all silent victims of isolation and neglect. The plaque contains only four names: Agnes, Mary, Louise, and Catherine, without dates or other details, a silent tribute to lives that almost went unnoticed by society. The legacy of the Branham case remains a grim reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation and institutional neglect. The story of the four sisters from Kentucky has become a case study in social service and medical colleges, showing the devastating effects of continuous inbreeding and the vital importance of social protection systems. In a retrospective report published in 2010 by the Kentucky Department of Health and Human Services, the commissioner wrote, "The Branham case represents a systemic failure that goes beyond specific individuals or departments. It was a failure of an entire society to recognize and protect its most vulnerable members. The lessons learned continue to shape our policies and practices to this day." Beyond the medical and legal aspects, the case raises deep questions about community, collective responsibility, and the complicit silence that sometimes allows horror to thrive in the shadows. As Dr. Helen Montgomery observed in her final report on the case, the tragedy of the Branham sisters was not just the result of terrible acts committed by individuals, but also of countless acts of omission by neighbors, officials, and institutions that chose not to see what was right in front of them. Today, the case remains one of the most extreme examples of inbreeding documented in American medical history, not only for the degree of genetic closeness involved but for the duration of the incestuous cycle over multiple generations. The physical and cognitive characteristics of the four sisters provided researchers with rare insights into the cumulative effects of severe endogamy in humans. The most inbred women of Kentucky, as they became known, never learned of the impact their existence would have on medicine, child protection laws, and public awareness. They lived and died in a limited world, first by the walls of a windowless house, then by the kinder walls of the institutions that finally offered them care. If you've watched this far, it's because you care about these cases that forever affect families. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far so I can get to know you and who really cares about the search for truth." Don't forget to like this video and share it with those who are also interested in real cases that make us reflect on the limits of the human condition.